Welcome to a special edition of the TimCo Retail Manager course. We built the TimCo Retail Manager application to simulate what a real-world application would look like so we can use it as a learning testbed. One of the big areas of focus was on the upgrade to .NET Core, since so many businesses are going to have to go through this process. We're now at that point in this application. In this video, we're going to upgrade our front-end class library to a .NET Standard 2.0 project. Now, the reason we're going to .NET Standard 2.0 instead of .NET Core 3.0 is because we want to upgrade our application in stages. A .NET Framework application can use a .NET Standard class library, but so can a .NET Core 3.0 project. So by doing it this way, we make our upgrade process easier and safer. For those of you who are Patreon members at the $5 per month level or higher, don't forget to head over to the Patreon page to get today's source code. This will also give you a chance to check out the special bonus offer for Patreon members only during this upgrade process. Mailing list members, you should have also gotten a special offer already this week. If you aren't a mailing list member, sign up using the link in the description. Another special offer will be going out later this week. Finally, I am launching this series as a course on IamTimCorey.com. This is something I've gotten a lot of questions about, people wanting this. So during this series, we're launching that course. You can purchase the entire course, including all the videos in this series, the source code for every video, fully downloadable content, and more. The course will cover everything through the .NET Core upgrade. If you've been a Patreon member paying for the source code each week, you'll be getting a great deal on this course. If not, you'll have to pay a little bit more, which is only fair, but you'll get everything all at once. Check out the link in the description for more details. Okay, time to dive into the source code. So here we have open already our WPF folder, because that's the front end, and today we're concentrating on our front end class library. We're going to upgrade this to .NET Standard 2.0. Again, .NET Standard 2.0 is not less than .NET Core 3.0. .NET Standard is kind of like an interface that allows us to use the same library with different projects. So you can use our .NET Standard library with .NET Core projects, with .NET Framework projects, and with other projects including Xamarin. So this is actually going to be an upgrade over even just .NET Core 3.0. Now the first step depends on where you want to start. Some people really like the idea of mapping this out and planning and testing, and there's tools for this. Microsoft has put out a tool that will look through all the things that you use in your application and say which ones are upgradable, which ones have to be changed, which ones are incompatible, and so on. The problem I find is it's a little bit of overload. It makes it more intimidating to upgrade even a simple application. So you have a little bit more complex application, it's really just too much at sometimes. At least it feels like that to me. So I take a different approach to upgrading. And that approach is that I just upgrade and see what breaks. Now that may be a little panic-inducing to you, or it may feel like that's irresponsible. Here's why it's not. We have everything in source control. Right now there's no changes. I can go to my sync and I can pull down or fetch any changes there aren't any. So I have everything in source control. I have it synced to my Azure DevOps account, which means that if I were to make a massive change and it were to break, that's not a problem. I can revert back. I can say, you know what? I don't want those changes. Let's roll them back. If this is a little bit more complex environment where maybe I have a team working on this project, I would even create a branch and do my changes there so that the rest of the team doesn't even see the changes as I'm working on them. And I have the time to really dig in and see if this is going to work or not, or how it's going to work. With just me on the team, it's a little easier. I'm actually going to make my changes right here as if it was just another update. And this is, again, small team or single person Git work. Okay? If you're on a little bit larger team with multiple people, then you're going to want to have separate branches. But today, I'm just going to make the change, see if it works, see what I need to change, and then if I have to, I can roll back and start over, or take my changes and put them into a new branch temporarily. Now, you should know what your dependencies are in your project you're upgrading. So my class library has a few dependencies, and they all have to do with NuGet packages. I have 2 NuGet packages installed, Microsoft.ASP.NET.WebAPI.Client, okay, and then also Newtonsoft.json. Those are the 2 things I have installed. So those we'll have to make sure are compatible with an upgrade or use something else in their place. Another part of the upgrade process is this packages.config file. This is where those references for those NuGet packages live. Notice that looks pretty familiar. Those are our 2 NuGet packages. Some of the documentation says that you'd want to right-click on this and say migrate packages.config to a package reference, which is going to put it inside your CS proj file. I recommend against that, and here's why. We can take these and leave them just as they are in packages.config. They'll be ignored in the new project setup, but that'll allow us to remember what was installed. Okay, so for a smaller list where you have, let's say, 10 or less dependencies, I prefer not to merge my packages.config file into my CS proj file. And let's see why. And I'll point out in just a minute. So the next step is to edit our CS proj file for this library. However, you can't just say right-click and edit for a .NET Framework project. Notice this is .NET Framework 4.7.2. I can't just edit this CS proj file because a .NET Framework, the CS proj file is live and you have to take it offline in order to make any changes. So that's what we'll do. We'll right-click and we're going to say unload project down near the bottom. Unload project. Now the CS proj file has been unloaded from our solution. We can right-click and say edit the CS proj file. And this is what we get. And this is the next place where I'm going to deviate from some of the standard recommendations for how to do an upgrade process. And I find that my way is easier, but it's up to you. Okay? So the standard wisdom is you need to read through this and understand what's going on and make sure you pull out things you might need. And I'm not going to do that because you don't need everything. In fact, in here, I don't need anything. It'd only be if I had merged in my NuGet packages that I would need to pull them out and copy them for later. So what I recommend is just to be on the safe side, do a Control-A, which is going to select everything, copy it, and paste it into Notepad or something else. Don't save it, just paste it in Notepad. Because the next step is Control-A again to select everything and delete it. And it seems scary, but don't worry. This is actually going to be a pretty painless process. This is the biggest part of an upgrade to .NET Core or to .NET Standard, and that is to change your CS proj file. So let's create a new CS proj file layout. Now, if you are a Patreon member, you'll have access to my conversion tips PDF. In that PDF, it outlines all the steps for conversion, and it outlines what each of these CS proj files should be, because they're a little different for each different project type. I'm actually reading off that because I don't remember them off the top of my head, and that's okay. So let's start with project, and then SDK equals. Notice IntelliSense is showing up, which is pretty awesome. Microsoft.net.sdk. No IntelliSense there. Next, we want the properties group, or property group. And then inside there, you want a target framework. And the target framework here is Net Standard 2.0. We're going to save that. That's the entire CS proj file as it stands right now. That's all we need. Now you might want to pause the screen here if you're not a Patreon member and can copy and paste from the PDF, because this is all very, very specific. If you change things a little bit, for example, I forgot the .NET at one point, that's different and that's a problem. So make sure that all your details are exactly the same as mine. Nothing even close to different, okay? Then you close out the CS proj file, because if you don't, it will not reload the project without closing it first, which is kind of funny because if I close this out and I say reload project, it's going to open that CS proj file back up for me. That's because we can now edit the CS proj file while it's running. Notice if I right click and I can come down here and say edit project file, and I can make changes to this file even though it's currently running. That's one of the new upgrades that .NET Core and .NET Standard have provided for us with this new project type file, is that we can make changes to it while it's live. And that's very, very helpful. All right, so next, if we right click and go to properties on our project, note that our target framework is now .NET Standard 2.0. I could go to 2.1, which I have installed on my machine. You might not. But one of the ways to do that is to make an edit and change that to 1. That's all you need to do the upgrade. I'm going to stay at 0, 2.0. That's a little more backward compatible with different frameworks. Now you may wonder, are we done? And the answer is no, we're not done. Let's right-click on dependencies and go to Manage NuGet Packages. The only NuGet package installed is the .NET Standard Library. That's it. There is no Newtonsoft.json. There is no web API. Now we could add those back, and we know which files they are because we still have the packages.config file, which has those two references. But I'm going to wait. And the reason why is I want to make sure I know where my errors are. Okay, so I'm going to do this by right-clicking on the library and saying build. And it's going to error out. We're going to get an error list. And the error list right now says duplicate system.reflection.assembly company attribute, which is redundant. So why is this duplicated? And even where is this? I don't remember typing this code. Well, you didn't. This is auto-generated code. This is under the properties folder. If you expand it out, you can see assembly info. This is how .NET Framework projects would create an assembly info section. Things like the attributes and all the rest. With .NET Standard and .NET Core, this is built on the fly. So in order to not have two of these, one that is generated on the fly and one that's already existing, we either have to delete this file or we have to say don't generate assembly info. Which you choose is based upon which one, if you have information here that you're using that's a little more in depth, you don't want to lose, and you don't want to transfer it over, then keep this one and don't generate the file. Otherwise, like we're going to do today, I'm going to right click on here and say delete. And I say yes, I want to delete that. And now if I build this project again, those errors will go away. And I have new ones. So one of the errors is about Configuration Manager. That's not something that the NuGet packages will help. But HTTP content does not contain a definition for read as async. That was what we were using our web API reference for. Okay, so that was what the NuGet package for that was. So that we do need that package for. So let's do this. Let's add just that package and see if we can get some of these errors to go away. We have 11 currently. So I'm going to right click on dependencies. Well, first I'm going to grab the packages and I'm going to copy this. This is the package we had installed. Let's right click and say manage NuGet packages. I'm going to browse. I'm going to paste that in. And the first one is the correct one. It will install because it is compatible with .NET Standard 2.0. So I install that. I accept the terms. And once it's installed, if I go to installed, now I can see that that is installed. That's also installed besides .NET Standard Library. Now let's do a build again. And this time, I have 3 errors instead of 11, and I have 1 warning. The packages element is not declared. Well, that's because I'm in packages.config, which it's not part of my project. So we can ignore that for now. We'll delete this file in just a minute. Okay, so it says the name Configuration Manager does not exist. So it can't get to Configuration Manager. And my suggestions are to install nlog or Microsoft Identity Model.protocols. Guess what? Neither of those is the right solution. So that's where the tooling is a little bit behind in things. This is not the right solution for our project. Instead, we need to right-click on dependencies and add a new NuGet package. System.configuration.configuration manager. All right, this one right here. System.configuration.configuration manager. Now, how do I know that's the right one? Well, it comes with a little bit of research. Okay, so when you're upgrading your project, you're going to be missing certain things. And part of it is because Microsoft with .NET Core, especially with .NET Standard, but with .NET Core also, has said, you know what, maybe we shouldn't put everything in this framework. Maybe we should have some things you can add in later if you need them. That way you're not always bringing down a configuration manager when you don't need it. And so instead they put Configuration Manager into its own NuGet package. It's a more modular approach to things. Notice now I have 0 errors and I have 1 warning. That warning is about my packages.config. I'm going to delete this file. Also note, I have not gotten rid of, or I have not added newtonsoft.json. Well, that came in with my other NuGet package. So when I added the Web API client, that kind of has Newtonsoft baked in. Okay, it says I'm kind of depending on that. Therefore, it brought it in. All right. So now, if we look at let's go get rid of app.config for a minute. And actually, for configuration, this shouldn't be here either. Since this is all set up for newtonsoft.json, what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete my app config since that's all it is. I don't need to have all the rest of this information. So I'm going to wait on it for just a minute. I will delete it in a little while. You can still use app.config in a .NET Standard or .NET Core project. It's just that that's not the way we want to go forward. But they allowed it in order to have some backward compatibility and make the upgrade process easier. Sometimes there's settings in there, though, that will cause conflict. So if you have settings for an email, for setting up an SMTP emailer, that causes some conflict. And I go over that in my Upgrading to .NET Core course. And there's going to be a link in the description for going to that course as well. And if you're a mailing list member or if you're a Patreon member, I believe you're going to get some discounts for that course as well. But that course covers, hey, what do you do in that situation? Okay, with cleaning up your app.config or web.config file during this process. Eventually, you want to get off it entirely, and I also go over how to do that. Okay, so let's build this again just to be sure. So we're going to build this project, and the build succeeded. There's no issues found. Therefore, let's start up this series of projects. So I have my API, which is going to start, and also my WPF project, which the WPF project is a .NET Framework 4.7.2, but it has a reference to my TRM Desktop UI.library, which is now a .NET Standard 2.0 project. So there's a reference there, and we haven't changed anything else. We've just changed our library. That's it. We've not touched anything else. Let's start this up and see what happens. And make sure all still works. So there's my, and you immediately get an error, which is awesome. So you have an API, we already have an error, and it says, hey, we've got a system.io.file not found exception, could not load file or assembly, system.configuration.configuration manager, version 4.0.3. One of its dependencies, the system cannot find the file specified. If we look at the details on this, it probably won't have a whole lot of extra information. We have our inner exception as null, so there's no information there. We could look through our stack trace and see if maybe there's something more information there, but there probably isn't. So we've got a problem, and the problem is in our API helper. So instead of me going and figuring out this error, behind the scenes and pausing the video and then working out, let's do this. I'm going to kind of poke around and try a couple things and just see what shakes loose. One of the things we talked about is this app.config file, where we don't really need it. And we do have something in here referencing Newtonsoft, which might not be right. So let's do this. Let's delete it. It's gone. Now, could that have caused a problem for me? Sure, it could have. Let's find out if it did. Let's start again. It's starting. Nope, same error. So that's interesting. It still hasn't found it, but cannot find the file specified. Seems like it might be an important clue here, because if it can't find the file specified, maybe that's an issue. Also, let's look at the version number here, 4.0.3.0. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit stop again. I'm going to look at my library, and I have the ASP.NET Web API.client, and this is the 527. And I have 470 and then a preview version for my configuration manager. Let's start with the easier one. Let's modify that so it's not a preview version. And then I'm going to look at, maybe do I need a web config that maybe has some app settings in it, just to be sure? Well, let's go to our dependencies first though. And I'm going to select our configuration manager, which is the one that has the issue. And there's a latest stable as 4.6. Let's update to that version instead, which seems odd that I'm saying an update to an older version. Let's also do a clean solution. Sometimes what happens is the system does not use the latest DLL. What it does instead is it uses a DLL that's already built. It's been cached. And so I'm going to make sure that I have the latest of everything by doing a clean. And now I'm going to do a start. So you see here, the upgrade issues aren't just going to be, same issue. Okay, so the upgrade issues aren't just going to be at design time where you have an error where it says, hey, I've got an error here. Sometimes you'll find issues at runtime as well. So let's do this. Let's make sure that our library, let's actually open up our UI just to be sure. We have an app.config file here, and that should be where it's reading everything from, but maybe, just maybe, we also needed that app config in our library. I don't think so, but let me do this. I'm going to copy, let's copy these settings right here. We'll just do our closing tag for configuration, okay? So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to create a new file in my library. And again, we're just experimenting here. So new item, let's do a config file. Let's see if we have one of those. This is going to be app config. So app.config. And in here, I am going to paste those settings. I'm going to take out the actual values though, and just have a key and a value. Let's make the key test and the value test. Why am I doing this? Just so it has a file to read from. Does that matter? I don't know. But this is part of debugging. Part of debugging is saying, I don't know, but let's try it and see what happens. Okay, we're launching. Same problem. Now it is saying that the version is 4.0.2, and that's not right because we have a different version in here. Oops, not in there. In here. We have a version 4.6. Can you roll back? Probably not, but let's find out. So can we go to 4. Nope, 4.4 is the earliest one we can go to. That's not the solution. So let's go ahead and get rid of the things that aren't really a solution. Let's delete those. And let's think through other possibilities. So let's do this. We have a problem. The problem is that our reference to system.configuration.configuration manager isn't really solving our problem, we think. Because we still have a problem with system.configuration.configuration manager. Let's start over by uninstalling system.configuration.configuration manager. Now we have our errors. Now if we look again here, our drop-down menu, it's going to tell us, control dot here, it's going to say nlog. That's not what we want here. We don't want Microsoft.identitymodel.protocols. So those aren't what we want. Down here we have a different one, configuration errors exception. This one, let's see if it's the same. It's not. It actually says install package system.configuration.configuration manager. I know we just uninstalled it. Let's do it again, just in case it did something different. And I'm also going to remove this system.configuration namespace it's using. And now let's do a control dot here. It does say add the using back in. Up here, the control dot, same thing, the same using statement. And if we look at the version here, it's 4.6 that it installed. I don't think it's going to change anything. I think we just uninstalled it and reinstalled it. That's all we did. But sometimes turning it off and turning it back on again works. It didn't. Okay, that's actually relieves me a little bit. Because of the fact it didn't work, that makes me feel a little better about what we're going to do next. So the error here is initialized client, which initialized client calls a configuration manager. That's the problem we're hitting right now. Is the configuration manager saying, hey, I can't find the file specified. So let's see if we can replace just this code with some different code that might work in a similar way. So let's try a system.environmental variable and see if we can grab that instead. So if we did system.environment.getEnvironmental variable, or environment variable, and the name is going to be API. I'm not sure if that's all we need. It did just say, okay, so retrieve the variable from the current process. I believe that's all we need. Let's find out. We can actually remove system because we already have a using system there. So getting the environmental variable just a different way, let's put a breakpoint right there and see if we get past that spot. Okay, it's starting up. And we hit the breakpoint. That's awesome. The API is null. That's not so awesome. So we got a step further, but this environmental variable, I should probably do some research on this because it seems like I'm either not using it correctly or it's not looking in the right spot. Because it should be going to app.config and looking up the app settings for API. And the more I think about this, the more I'm wondering if maybe environment is not quite the right word I want, or the right setting. I'm going to start this again. We're just going to play around just a little bit with, now I have a breakpoint here. I can go to my immediate window. I can pin this. And now I can start playing around with things like environment dot get environmental variables, or get environment, not environmental. Get environmental variable, environment variable, there we go. And I wonder if there's a pathing issue here where it's actually, since it's in the config, it's actually configuration, app settings, then API, something like that. That might be an issue. But let's try API again. Let's try configuration. But I believe that's the root. Configuration or app settings. So let's try app settings. That's null. And configuration, null as well. So as you're seeing here, a little bit of head banging where you're just trying things and getting nowhere and it feels like you're making no progress. And that's okay. This is how debugging works. And I really want to put this in here. I do want to show the fact that it's not all sunshine and roses when you upgrade. Upgrades take some work, and don't get discouraged by that. That's why we have Git and source control. So you can do the work and maybe even put it on pause for a little bit and do the real work of making updates to your project, whatever, and then come back and keep working on this. Okay? I'm going to say configuration manager dot app settings. Now, can I just do app settings like that? I have two values. All right, so I have all keys, string of 2, count of 2. Let's do this. If we can do a dot, I can say, it's come off the screen, sorry about that, but I can do, let's do keys. Count as 2. I can also do, you know what, let's do this. The first item. That's localhost. That's my API path. That's interesting. And what's the second one? That's 8.75. That would seem like these two values right here, and it is. So why is it that it's not reading the name? It's just reading the number. Let's try this again and say API, and it does get it. So it gets that path. That's interesting. So with calling a local window, this is working the way we expect it to. App settings and API. Let's go over here, app settings API. So it looks like if we were to make this change here, that it looks like it should be that we put the right value into API. And API does have a null value. Let's start over. We're going to put a breakpoint right before. So let's start this again. It's going to hit the breakpoint, and nope, it's not even going to do that. So it's not even hitting the breakpoint yet. So it's not even getting to the point of this right here. It's saying, you know what? I can't load the file or assembly system.configuration.configuration manager. So it's not even getting to the point of calling our initialized client. Okay, so I think this is a squirrely issue. And by squirrely, I don't mean squirrely the installer, or squirrely installer. I think this has to do with the fact that there may be a version, let's go references here. There may be a version of, there's not a version of the system.configuration.configuration manager installed in our WPF project. We didn't need it because we used the built-in. But let's see if we can install system.configuration.configuration manager. I'm not a huge fan of doing this because I am modifying a different project and I didn't want to do that. But let's see if this works, and then we'll see if it's going to cause any other problems. So I just installed it in my WPF project. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this again and see if it works. Okay, I hit my API configuration, so that's good. Let's go to the next step. And my API, let's go to our locals window, or output window. Locals, there we go. API that's the correct API URL, so that's great. So it actually is reading. Now let's bring up our API. Let's shrink this down a bit. And let's also bring up our WPF project. So the API is loaded. Let's log in. See what happens. We logged in, it all seems to be working now. So we're all good to go. So now our project has been updated. We had to take some tweaks and modifications to get it to work, but we did get it to work. Now, that's a little bit of a pragmatic approach. In fact, it's a lot of a pragmatic approach. A pragmatic approach is basically where you say, whatever works, that's what we're going to do. And in some cases, that's what you have to do when upgrading, because of the fact that it's not always going to be smooth. And I did want you to see this, because that's why we created this real-world style project in .NET Framework, because there's going to be some ugly, messy changes that we have to do in order to get this to work with a new system. And the reason why we did it in .NET Framework first is because that's what a lot of the industry uses is .NET Framework. And they're going to want to go to .NET Core. And they're going to need people like you who get this experience in upgrading to .NET Core to help them. And so this messiness, that's the real world. So let's talk through the downsides of what we just did. We just added a new NuGet package to a project that we haven't changed over to .NET Core yet. So we made a modification to an existing system, and that's not ideal. However, what we did was we found out that the version of the system.configuration in TRM Desktop UI was conflicting with the version we had in our TRM Desktop UI.library. Normally, we try to match those versions up, and we did, but we had to match up in the direction I didn't want to go, and that was we brought up the WPF project rather than bringing down the library project. And the reason we did that is because of the fact that the WPF project was using a much older version, and so we couldn't go down that far in our .NET Standard project. All right, so with that being done, if we do a rebuild the solution, make sure all builds, and I think that we are good to go. We have tested what we can. We don't have unit tests in place. That's one of the areas that would have helped us more is if we had unit testing. So we can run those unit tests again and make sure things still work the way they were before. But otherwise, we got it to run. We did some small things to make sure that it's working, and it seems to be. So I think we can declare this a successful upgrade of our TRM Desktop UI.library to .NET Standard 2.0. All right, so with that, I think we're going to wrap the video up right here. And then in our next video, we're going to upgrade the other class library, which is our TRM Data Manager.library, the library that supports our API. All right, thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.